Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you join Registrar Corp today for our webinar, How to Respond to a U.S. FDA Food Inspection. I'm Anna Benavente, Registrar Corp's Director of Regulatory Affairs, and I will be moderating for us today. Today's speaker is Larry Stringer. Larry worked for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for more than 34 years. During that time, he held many positions. He was a field investigator in Chicago and West Virginia, where he inspected a wide range of food facilities. He conducted inspections both in the U.S. and abroad. He supervised investigators, including FDA expert investigators. In his last 7 years, he was in charge of a group of experts responsible for development of assignments and various guidance documents, including the Investigations Operations Manual, or IOM, guidance on conducting inspections during COVID, and guidance on conducting remote regulatory assessments. Larry was a lead trainer for new investigators in collecting and developing evidence during inspections and investigations. Larry retired earlier this year. He is now an independent consultant with Canal Row Advisors. Canal Row Advisors is a consulting firm focused on helping industry comply with FDA regulations.
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. I am excited to present this webinar about how to respond to an FDA inspection. I'll be covering several areas, but primarily I plan to take you inside FDA and show you what happens after an inspection so you can understand how to respond to the inspection. I'll start with the issuance of the FDA 483 and talk about various adverse actions FDA can take, and I'll give you tips on how to manage the outcome of an inspection. There should be time at the end for plenty of questions, and I'll do my best to answer as many as possible. This is the second of a two-part series on FDA inspections and responses. The first one is available on the Registrar Corp YouTube channel if you want to watch that later. I want to start by stating that what happens post-inspection depends both on what the investigator found and what you do. If you take the observations seriously and respond to them appropriately, there's a very good chance of avoiding serious consequences. I can't promise FDA won't take action after an inspection, but I can tell you what you can do to reduce the likelihood of FDA doing something. I started by mentioning that we'd go over the 483, or also known as the FDA Inspectional Observations Form. Although it is the closeout of the inspection, the FDA 483 is really the beginning of FDA actions. The mere issuance of a FDA 483 is an action and a warning that further action could come. When I would issue an FDA 483, I would direct management to these two statements that appear on the back of the 483. Why is the FDA 483 issued? First and foremost, the 483 is required by law. The U.S. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requires issuance of a 483 at the conclusion of inspection. The second statement says that it's there to assist you to comply with the law. While the 483 is often considered a negative outcome of an inspection, it's better not to get one. It was not always viewed that way. When I started, it honestly was a document the industry wanted to see, and I had people request certain items even be put on the 483 so that they remembered and knew to make corrections to them. A little bit additional background on the 483. The 483 is presented to the top management official on site, generally the owner, operator, or plant manager. It's done at the closeout meeting, and I discussed the closeout meeting during the previous presentation 2 weeks ago. These are the CSO's observations. It says specifically, observed by him, which in his judgment. The law basically has two criteria for the observations on the 483. The first one consists in whole or in part of any filthy, putrid, or decomposed substance. This means that the food itself is adulterated. For example, histamine can form in tuna, making it unsafe. If there is found through sampling that the tuna contains histamine, then the tuna is decomposed, meeting that criteria. The second criteria is has been prepared, packed, or held under insanitary conditions. This is the GMP, PC, HACCP violation. There isn't direct evidence of an adulterated product, But there is evidence that a food could become adulterated because of conditions in the facility and a failure to follow specific regulations related to the product or process. This is when, although histamine may not have been found or tested for in the tuna, the investigator found the refrigerator was broken and the tuna was being stored at 60 degrees Fahrenheit at the time that they started the inspection. I want to specifically note what is not required to be put on a 483 because this is important. Misbranding or labeling violations are not placed on the 483. A few times allergen issues are placed on them, but those aren't technically compliance with misbranding. Those are compliance with the allergen rule. So most labeling problems are not cited on the 483 and are discussed with you at the close of the inspection. This does not mean they're not significant and they still require correction. A couple of points on the 483, and I mentioned this before. Although the 483 is the judgment of the investigator, it really does reflect the agency's position. It used to be that the CSO had full control of 483, but this is not really accurate any longer. CSOs are told not to let anyone dictate the items on the 483 for them. But if there are significant problems and issues, the 483, you should understand, has probably been fully reviewed and vetted by others in the agency. You can pretty much expect it to stand up to further scrutiny within FDA. The 483 is not a final decision, but you really should treat it as though each violation may result in an adverse outcome. As I noted earlier, the 483 does not cover labeling or misbranding violations. The 483 is not an exhaustive list. There may be additional issues that you need to correct, but during an inspection, the FDA investigator can only look at so much because time is obviously limited. In addition, there may be verbal observations, not just mislabeling or misbranding issues. You need to pay particular attention to those as well because they can appear on a future 483 if they're not corrected. I've listed in the next two slides the most common observations found in 2024 by FDA. The first one is you did not develop a food safety verification plan specifically, and then the details would appear after that. So it would list the product that you specifically didn't have an FSVP for. That's the number one observation. I don't think we should be surprised by that because FSVP is a new program, but I wanted to point that out. I'm not going to go through each one of these. You can look at them later on the YouTube video if you want, but these are the most common ones, and they've been fairly common for the last few years as well. And here's the second slide. So I listed, I believe it's 7 of the most common ones, and you can go back and review that on the YouTube video if you want to look at that, or you can ask questions about it later. Okay. Not all inspections end with the 483, but all end with a closeout meeting. Even if there's only a closeout meeting without a 483, there will likely be observations presented to you. These are known as verbal observations. They will appear in the written report, and FDA expects correction to those as well. They also appear in the FDA data system. So FDA has a data system where they keep all the data about you, and those observations specifically will be in the data system, although they won't appear public. Failure to correct those verbal observations may result in those being put on the 483 during the next inspection. When you receive the 483, it'll be handed to you and it will be read to you. You can pause the investigator and say, I'd like to take a look at this, a detailed look at this before we go over it. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I suggest you do that you read each observation yourself before they read it to you. Make sure it's accurate. Ask any questions. As they read through it, you can note questions as you're reading through it, but as they read through it, ask any questions to make sure you understand the specific observation. The observations can be hard to understand sometimes because they quote the regulations and then they say specifically, and the specifically really tells you what is going on at your facility, what needs to be corrected. So pay attention to the specifically. And if there are errors, tell the CSO this is not correct, and get those corrected. They spend a lot of time working on their 483s, so there usually aren't any errors, but it is not unusual for there to be errors. There is a process. If they come back to the office and find an error for reissuing the 483, it isn't common to happen, but I have seen 483s get corrected while in the plant during the issuance of the 483. Okay, so what do you do with the 483? Well, you should respond in writing as directed by the CSO. They will give you an email to send your response to. Use that. Don't send it directly to the CSO. You can copy them, but honestly, they're moving on to the next inspection, so they may or may not look at your response. But make sure you send it to the correct email address. Respond to each observation. I would encourage a response to the verbal observations as well, but it is not necessary. You generally have 15 business days to respond. It may be 30 business days in some cases, but 15, if it's done within 15 business days, FDA will take note of those responses, and they should be included in the report as long as the report is still being written. So I would really highlight responding as quickly as possible. Try to respond earlier if you can. Some of the CSOs may have a lot of work to do, and they want to get that inspection report written within 5 days. If they write that report within 5 days, then your responses won't be included in their written report. Be specific in your response. If you complete corrections, provide evidence that they are corrected. Photographs, copies of training records, new procedures, whatever is required, provide evidence. If you can't complete the corrections within the 15-day time frame, explain your planned corrections and a time frame for completing them, and follow up with additional responses as you make corrections. Your response needs to be well organized. This is important. Even if 2 observations are corrected by 1 corrective action, respond to each individually in the order they appear in the 483. So the 483 will have observation 1, respond to observation 1. It'll have observation 2, respond to observation 2. I would encourage you to copy the 483 observation 1, failure to have an FSVP, specifically copy that into there, and then underneath it, explain your correction, and then have exhibits. And exhibit 1 or exhibit 2 or whatever would be the exhibit that demonstrates the correction to that observation. Go point by point, addressing each item in order. The reviewer, and I mentioned this during our last presentation, if you make things easier on FDA, things will be easier on you. The reviewer is going to be reviewing your response along with the 483 in their hand and the report, which describes the observations. So they're going to want to look at those in the order that they're presented. They're not going to want to have to jump back and forth through the report. They can, but it's easier for them if they're done in order. State what you did immediately to correct the problem. Provide evidence or documentation of that correction. For example, if you were cited for having insects in a raw ingredient, tell FDA what you did with that raw ingredient and what you did with any product you made from it. Conduct a root cause investigation to determine if there are any systemic problems that caused the original issue. If not, tell FDA you conducted a root cause analysis and were unable to determine a root cause. If you find one, though, address it as well and provide specific evidence that it was also corrected. Going back to my example, you may have immediately destroyed the ingredient that contained the insects, but your root cause might show that the ingredient came to you from the supplier with the insects. You may have changed suppliers, updated inspection of product at receipt, updated supplier certification requirements. Whatever you did to correct the root cause, don't forget to include that item when you're responding. Tell FDA what actions are completed and what actions are planned, and provide realistic timeframes for completing them. If you have multiple sites that operate and produce the same kind of product, consider if you need to make those same corrections at the other locations too, and tell FDA that you make corrections at other sites. Follow up on incomplete actions when they are completed with another response. You can request a meeting with FDA so that you can answer any questions and explain your corrections in detail. FDA is not obligated to meet with you, but merely offering to meet with FDA indicates how serious you are taking the observations and making corrections. FDA is developing a web portal so that you can submit corrections directly to them online. This is specifically for food companies. But for now, that system is still under development and testing. Once it is open, I expect there to be a public release and videos on the FDA YouTube channel demonstrating how it can be used, as well as guidance provided at the close of the inspection. But for now, respond in writing with a letter. And even after this is open, I'm sure FDA will continue to accept letters from industry showing corrections. Okay, now we're going to talk about what happens at the FDA after the inspection. First, the investigator has between 5 and 30 days to complete the report. I mentioned that 5-day window. If it's serious and FDA has to take action on the product right away, that 5-day deadline is the deadline for completing the report for a seizure action. If samples were collected, they may be analyzed by the lab, and that may be ongoing after the inspection is complete. The supervisor reviews and initially classifies the report either NAI, VAI, OAI, and I'll describe that further later. The report that you receive, you will receive the report within about 40 days. That report that you receive will not include the endorsement written by the supervisor. It will not include the classification. But you should receive a compliance classification notice, even for OAI inspections. At around that 45-day mark, you should get either with the report or separately an email stating your compliance status. If FDA is considering official action, the report will not be sent until that action is complete and the compliance case is closed. If the inspection is OAI, the report and the exhibits are reviewed by a compliance officer at headquarters, and they draft any action FDA will take. The compliance officer may consult with subject matter experts and with FDA legal counsel about the appropriate action before completing it. Let's quickly go over the classifications and then discuss the FDA actions. So I mentioned there are 3 classifications. No action indicated, often shortened to NAI. That means a 483 generally wasn't issued. Now, I did mention misbranding issues could result in a VAI or even an OAI inspection without a 483 being issued, but those are rare. NAI generally means no 483 was issued. That's obviously the best way to end an inspection. However, remember too that there may be verbal observations, and make corrections to those. You don't necessarily have to respond to FDA to those verbal observations, but make corrections to those, because if they remain uncorrected, they may appear on the 483 next time. VAI means an inspection had a 483, but the findings are not significant enough for the agency to follow up with an official action. VAI inspections may, however, include a letter called an untitled letter or regulatory letter, and they may come with a regulatory meeting. FDA may request a meeting with you to discuss the observations. The reason for the letter or the meeting is to provide documentation that the agency notified top management about the issues noted during the inspection. And finally, OAI, or official action indicated, means that the agency plans to take some kind of official action, and we'll go over those now. I've listed them all here. I'm going to highlight a few. FDA has a series of ways that it can act if it feels correction is necessary, and if the agency feels that without their action, the corrections may not be made. Untitled and regulatory meetings are considered voluntary corrections. They're issued after a VAI inspection generally, but they do indicate the agency probably wanted to send a warning letter or could have sent a warning letter, but for a number of reasons it did not. It could be the time frames are outside, or there's a lack of evidence to support some of the 483 points, or it could be that the review noted something that should have been on the 483 but wasn't, and so it was added to the regulatory letter. Regardless of the reason, take these very seriously, because FDA will follow up on them. I'm going to jump down to import alert, or DWPE, detention without physical exam. That applies to foreign firms, obviously. It stops you from importing products. You can still import, but FDA will hold the product until you prove the product meets FDA requirements. You should find out from FDA what it wants from you when it issues the import alert. Typically, it would come in the form of a warning letter. FDA can take away your registration. This is extremely rare. It makes it so that you cannot make products at your facility, or you cannot ship them to the US if you are outside the US. It's seldom used because it's really only used when the public health is jeopardized, when there is a significant issue. It can happen in the middle of an inspection. There are very strict timeframes on completing a registration cancellation or suspension. Warning letters. We'll probably spend most of our time kind of discussing warning letters. That's the most common action that FDA takes. You should respond to the warning letter just as you did to the 483. Respond to each item, keep it organized. FDA can ask for a regulatory meeting with the warning letter. It does primarily when it feels that it is very significant, but not serious enough to support another action, or it's outside of the timeframes that are reasonable for completing another action, for example, a seizure. If a seizure is contemplated, but it's like 6 months after the inspection, when the appropriate documents are completed for the seizure to be conducted, FDA sometimes will downgrade that action to a warning letter because seizing a product 6 months after inspection makes people question the seriousness that FDA took the issue. Respond as soon as possible to the warning letter. Generally, you will be given a time frame. Generally, you'll be given a time frame for response. Typically, it's 30 days. If a regulatory meeting is requested, either with a warning letter or with a regulatory meeting, show up in person if you're invited to, if possible. Bring documentation that support the corrections. You can even prepare a presentation for FDA. FDA may or may not allow you to give a presentation. FDA considers it their meeting, not yours. So they will set the agenda. They'll go over what they expect. But if you have a presentation ready, they will often let you present it to them or give it to them. It's really good if the highest ranking person responds to the 483. So the top management official, the owner, operator, agent in charge, CEO, those are the type of people who really should be sending the response to the warning letter. And they should also attend any reg meeting involved. Even if they don't draft the response, again, you're demonstrating how seriously you take the response by having top management involved. The purpose of the reg meeting is not to listen to you, but to warn you. It is FDA's meeting. They will direct it. Don't argue during the meeting. You can disagree with the findings, but do so professionally and be sure that you are correct. FDA does everything possible not to make mistakes on 483s and on warning letters, but it has happened. And if you find that there is a mistake, make sure that you highlight it for FDA. If you've hired a consultant to help you respond, you can bring them to any meetings. We'll discuss briefly recalls. Typically, recalls happen during an inspection and they're voluntary, but for food products, FDA can initiate a mandatory recall. FDA will always call you first and say, we would want this product recalled, or they'll generally say, what do you think you should do with this product? They'll lay out all the problems and they'll say, what do you think you should do with this product? Which is a hint to you that they think you either need to destroy it or recall it. If you decide to do a recall, it typically happens during the inspection, not afterwards, but whoever you tell, we're going to go ahead and recall this product, you will be directed to a recall coordinator within FDA to deal with the recall. Those people are experts in recalls. They are there to really help you do the recall right, especially if you've never done a recall before. They're your friend. Work closely with them and do what they ask you to do related to the recall. A little thought of action that FDA can take is publicity. It used to be used a lot more. It's not used so frequently anymore. It's generally used when there's a public health concern and the firm won't do their own press release. Again, like a recall, FDA will often ask, what do you plan to do? And if it's a serious class 1 recall where people's lives are in danger, FDA will ask you, are you going to announce this to the public? If you fail to announce to the public, FDA will likely draft their own press release and issue it without your review. You don't want that happening. And having said that, everything FDA does is public because it is a government agency. So everything is available to the public. The last few items, seizure, injunction, prosecution, those three actually have to go through a U.S. court for the action to take place. Seizure is a civil action in the U.S. court against a specific lot or lots of product. It's not done frequently now. Product is actually taken by the U.S. Marshals. They arrive at your facility and they arrest the product and you can't use it. They'll often leave it intact and they'll put tape around it telling you not to touch it. At this point, unless it's a labeling issue or something that you can easily correct, it probably isn't worth fighting the seizure unless it has a real high value. FDA will ask you, what do you plan to do with the product? And you can tell them, I plan to destroy this product, and that will pretty much end the seizure. You can also recondition the product. The reconditioning plan will have to go through review by FDA before it can be implemented. You can go to court and defend the product, but that almost never happens. FDA makes sure its evidence is sufficient to carry through the seizure before they even contemplate doing a seizure. If FDA gives you an agreement related to the seizure, be very cautious of that and make sure you read it carefully or have lawyers read it. FDA may try and put into that some language that requires you to report to FDA monthly about something, or not to release certain products until FDA reviews records related to them. You don't want that happening to you. So be careful if they try to send you a seizure agreement document. Injunctions. This is when FDA is trying to tell you how to run your business. There are times it may be the only way to keep your business open, but it can be very expensive. FDA charges you for the time spent related to the injunction once it's issued. They bill you for hours, they bill you for travel. Many injunctions allow FDA to recall products if they don't like what you're doing. They're ongoing, they relate to product you make in the future, not just product made in the past. Seizures cover past actions, injunctions cover future actions. Many injunctions have no expiration. In other words, they will continue forever. Try not to let that happen. There's such a thing called a sunset clause. This will end an injunction. So you can tell FDA, we'll agree to the injunction, but after 3 NAI inspections, we want the injunction to end, or some kind of language like that. And you really need to be working with lawyers at this point. If it doesn't have that sunset provision, you will need to go to the court and convince a judge that you are operating within the law. And if you haven't talked to FDA and FDA agrees with you, then you're unlikely to win that argument, because FDA will come in and say, no, they aren't in compliance. And they'll argue that case, and it can get very expensive going to court. Prosecution. FDA can prosecute companies and people for violating the FD&C Act, but these are misdemeanor prosecutions, and it doesn't expend resources on those very often. It would take a very significant case for FDA to prosecute either an individual or a company, and it just isn't really worth the time of FDA or the Department of Justice or the courts to tie up those courts with misdemeanor prosecutions. There are way too many other issues that need to be addressed in the courts. The last one, civil money penalties, can be used. That is actually an administrative issue, administrative action. It happens within FDA. It doesn't go to court. You're given a notice. I don't think they're used often in food. In fact, I haven't seen one used in the food industry yet, but they are possible. Okay, why should you respond to FDA? First and foremost, FDA has a list of violations for each firm in its internal data systems. I mentioned that. These are basically the violations that were noted during the inspection. Even though some observations are made only verbally and not recorded on the 483, they are still kept in the FDA's data system until they're corrected and verified to be corrected. So until the next inspection, those will remain in the system, and they will appear when someone reviews your company's report internally to FDA. When they review the inspection report, they'll see those verbal observations, and they will see that they are not corrected. Those violations are reviewed during the next inspection. Even VAI and NAI inspections may require follow-up to violations. When correction is made and verified, the data system is updated, and those no longer appear as a pending problem. Second, any response made is considered by FDA when it decides what action to take. If you make serious corrections and verify them and provide evidence, it requires the agency to weigh your corrections versus the action that they intended to take. It also requires time and energy for the agency to take the action. So even if it is considering an action, if you've made corrections, the FDA may not take further action simply because you've made sufficient correction and there's nothing more that the agency could ask you to do. FDA prefers to use its actions on bad actors, people who, that's the phrase that's used internally, people who don't respond to 483s, don't respond adequately. Those are the people that FDA tends to take action against. And while it can be and will be, while it can and will take actions based on first offenses, generally the offenses need to be pretty egregious and pretty clearly not corrected for FDA to take action. Thirdly, responding can delay an action by FDA because each response needs to be reviewed and used in an assessment of the appropriate action. This can be very frustrating internally to FDA because we receive a response and then the compliance officer says, oh, wait, we have to hold up on that action because we have to review this response. But from your perspective, that delay is a good thing because various actions have internal timeframes that need to be adhered to. If an action is beyond those internal timeframes, then it can get downgraded. For example, if FDA is considering a seizure and you respond, demonstrate violent product was destroyed, it would not make sense for FDA to process a seizure action. It may still decide to send a warning letter or regulatory action because of the observations made, but the legal action of a seizure would not have occurred, and you won't have had to deal with that. Fourth, if you respond, FDA will address your response in the report if you respond quick enough. So for a warning letter, FDA will state that it acknowledges that you made correction to the observations. This is good. When the warning letter is released to others, they will likely see that FDA recognized that you made corrections. In general, though, if your responses are adequate, a warning letter would be downgraded to an untitled letter, or an untitled letter may not be sent at all. FDA has internal processes to determine what it should do after an inspection. And generally, how it chooses the action depends on several things. FDA first weighs the evidence to ensure the case is proven. If the evidence is weak, the case may not even be referred for compliance action. The supervisor may note significant issues aren't covered through evidence, and that is why FDA investigators spend so much time documenting problems, collecting records, taking photos, collecting samples, additional things, just to make sure that they have their evidence in line. Second, FDA evaluates the seriousness of the issue. Seriousness usually involves a threat to public health. If left uncorrected, what is the likelihood of someone becoming sick or dying from the food? The Sakota issue. FDA reviews your responses to the violations. FDA subject matter experts review the observations along with any corrections to determine if people may become ill or injured if there's no correction. If the answer is yes, it is very likely the minimum response will be a warning letter. I've listed here progressive enforcement. This is something that FDA talks about internally as well. It's part of your compliance record. It's kind of like the policeman who pulls you over and sees that you haven't had a speeding ticket in the last couple of years, and they say, oh, I'll let you go with a warning, you weren't that high over the speed limit, but next time don't speed. But if they catch you a second time and it's in their database showing that you're speeding, then they will issue that speeding ticket. FDA does the same sort of thing. It considers your past history with compliance issue. Did you follow through on corrections to previous observations? Is this observation a repeated violation? And one that people sometimes don't consider is, have these violations been seen at other sites under the same ownership? I mentioned this before. If you're a large corporation with multiple sites, FDA can look and see that you've had the same violation at multiple sites and decide it's time to give corporate a warning letter to make sure it's corrected everywhere and not just at the individual site where it was found during the inspection. How thorough is your response? This is why I spent so much time discussing the response. It does make a difference. So when FDA would seize a product, FDA will seize it if the product is a danger and if you're voluntarily holding it. So here's one thing that I do encourage, and this has to do specifically with finished product where you receive notice that a sample is violative. I would recommend destroying it. Destruction would keep FDA from seizing the product, and likely the outcome would be the same in the end. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through these. This is directly from FDA's data dashboard, and it may be difficult to see. I've highlighted specific things, but I wanted you to see how public the information is. Searching on their dashboard isn't always easy, but there are many features for searching, and if you spend some time looking at it, you can see it. Here I'm showing some of the most recent food inspections. The first block shows whether there were violations and what the classification of the inspection was. I mentioned everything is public. The second block shows what the specific violations were. I don't know if you can read it, but you can see that the first one was had to do with FSVP. In fact, the first three had to do with FSVP issues. Here's an example of a specific firm, and I don't mean to disparage the specific firm. This is straight off the FDA website, but it demonstrates how quickly a warning letter can be issued. So an inspection was completed on September 9th, 2025, and 30 days later, on October 9th, 2025, a warning letter was issued. This is why response to that 483 is so important, and that 15-day, getting that response in within 15 days makes a difference. If you wait 30 days, you will have had that warning letter issued to you already. So that's why that 15-day time frame is so important. This demonstrates a company where there was reasonable compliance record all the way through 2022. You can see the inspections. I'll show you what those inspections were classified in a minute. My point here is past compliance does not guarantee future compliance. You can see that in 2024, there was an inspection. In 2024, there was a warning letter. In 2025, there was a follow-up inspection. And here's more specifics about that. You can see the 6 inspections, the NAI, VAI inspections, and the 1 OAI inspection. Here's a firm where there was an inspection conducted in May, again conducted in June, and then a seizure taken. This is an example of kind of progressive enforcement, but actually what probably happened was the CSO did the inspection and a seizure was recommended. It went to compliance for review. Compliance reviewed it, and about 2 months later, they said, oh, we do need to seize, but let's make sure that the violations are continuing. The firm may have failed to respond and say what they were doing with the product. So the FDA investigator went back. They found the same conditions existed. And so the compliance officer said, okay, this company is not going to make correction. We need to do the seizure to make sure they get the message. That's my explanation of probably what happened with this firm. You can see here the 2 OAI inspections for that firm back to back. And finally, this is the actual 483 items for the firm. And you can see that the first one is qualification of individuals. And that's from the June inspection. And from the May inspection, qualification of individual. Plants and grounds was the second, plants and grounds. So you can see there was no correction made. And that's why I said that's likely what happened. So in summary, responding to an inspection can be extremely important to your firm, to your compliance record. Everything is open to the public, as I demonstrated. Inspection reports can be used by you and by your competitors. So keep that in mind. And I thank you for your time. I believe there are some questions that I need to respond to. Anna, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Thank you, Larry, for all that wonderful information. Extremely valuable. So what I'd like to do, though, is certainly thank everybody for joining us today. If you have questions, please do add them to the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen rather than the chat box. And before we move to the Q&A session, just a quick reminder that when you exit the webinar, there will be a brief 3-question survey that will appear. So we'd really appreciate your feedback on helping us improve future webinars and developing topics that will be interesting to you and also valuable. So thanks again for being here. So let's take a look at some of the questions. I think you have some questions from the previous webinar, Larry, am I right?
Yeah, you have those, Anna? You have those questions, Anna?
Are they on the next few slides, I believe?
No, they're not.
Okay, yes, I can go ahead and grab those. 1 second. Okay, so first one is we only export certain products to the US. What if on the day of inspection, we are producing products that we don't export?
So if you're a foreign company and FDA tells you they're going to come, it'd be nice if you were producing the products that are exported. But if you happen to not be producing those products, what FDA will do is they'll still do the inspection. If the product is the same sort, you're using the same kind of equipment, same kind of processes, then they will spend time reviewing those processes and making sure that you're in compliance. And the second thing they'll do is they'll look at the records related to the product that you do ship to the US. So they'll spend time reviewing those records, making sure that that what you're doing is producing a safe product relating to that. It's unfortunate that they can't look at the specific product that you do ship to the US, but they will make do and they'll figure out how to do it. FDA investigators are pretty innovative and figure out ways to do things when things aren't always optimal.
Okay, great, thank you. So then another question from the previous webinar, does the FDA follow up to our 483 response?
Yes, the response though may very well be simply that they've received it and it's being reviewed, or they received it and it will be verified during the next inspection. It very much depends on what you provide with it to support the correction. So for example, if you were missing your PC, you don't have a PCQI, and they cite you for not having PCQI, and you provide a certificate showing you have a PCQI, that your food safety plans have been reviewed by the PCQI, then they may very well say in the letter, acknowledge, yes, you've corrected, we appreciate that. In a response letter, say, yes, we acknowledge that you have made correction and we appreciate that, or some kind of wording like that. But yes, they will respond to your 483, but frequently it might be that we acknowledge receipt and the items will be verified during the next inspection. That's why it's important to provide those exhibits demonstrating that you have made those corrections as best as you can. Some things you can't demonstrate necessarily through documentation, but if you can, it's a good idea to do so.
Okay, wonderful, very helpful. So this one's a little complicated. When there is a foreign supplier, company A, to a foreign site, company B, who makes products for the US, does company A need to be registered with the FDA?
Okay, so let me try and give an example of this. So company A ships to the US. It could be, for example, a bakery. Say you're a bakery and you ship product to the US. If you receive flour from company B that you then incorporate into your product, cookies or pastries or whatever, the company that makes that flour does not need to be registered, even though they're supplying you with the flour. The reason for that is a term that is used in the FDA. Legally, it means the term is de minimis processing. So if you've done more than de minimis processing to the product, then it does not need to be registered. But if you do de minimis processing, and let me give you an example of that. You are a company that repackages flour. So the first example, we had the bakery that took the flour and made it into cookies or pastries. If you're a company that repackages flour just to put it into packages with labeling for the US and you ship it to the US, that would be considered de minimis. You haven't changed the flour itself. All you've done is put it into individual smaller packages or packages with American labeling on it. In that case, you have done de minimis processing, in which case your supplier would need to be registered because their product is going directly to the US. Is that clear, Anna?
Yes, kind of sounds like the substantial transformation condition with customs in the country of origin. Sounds really similar. Okay, great, thank you. Next question. We are a BRC certified company from the UK. Are there differences between the inspections? Is this necessary for FDA to visit our facility if we had a globally recognized certification?
Okay, so for those of you who may not know, BRC is the British Regulatory Commission, and they do inspections, and FDA has looked at their inspection process, has looked at their audits, and has said they're very similar, but they do not have a mutual recognition agreement. So there's no mutual recognition between the BRC and the FDA at this time. It would require FDA to have a mutual recognition agreement in order for you to avoid inspection. However, if you have an audit from the BRC that shows that you're in compliance with the BRC requirements, I would encourage you, if you're contacted by FDA, you'll typically get an email and they'll say, we want to inspect your firm. Here's some, we need more information about you. I would reply and say, hey, you know what? That's fine. You can come inspect. That's great. But you should know that we had recently a BRC audit. And by recent, I mean within the last year. And here's a copy of the results of that audit. FDA may reconsider their desire to inspect you, knowing that you are in compliance with BRC requirements. So I encourage you to consider sharing that with FDA. it may not stop FDA from doing inspection, but maybe make them consider the resources. Again, FDA foreign inspections are costly. They want to use them to the best advantage, and inspecting a firm that's in compliance with BRC requirements and the global audit that they do is really not a good use of their resources, I would think. But again, that's up to the individual circumstances.
Gotcha. So I'm getting a theme from your entire presentation that being proactive and volunteering information can definitely help a company, certainly navigate an FDA inspection very well. Okay, great. Next question is, does sampling occur for overseas sites?
It can. It's not easy when you're overseas to collect a sample, ship it to the US for analysis, et cetera. But for certain programs, it is done. Infant formula, foreign samples are collected. If it's a significant issue, if there's an outbreak, illness involved, it is very likely that FDA may send a sampling team or an individual to collect samples of your facility or of your products. It may increase surveillance at the border as well through sampling a product that comes in. So it does depend. It is not typically done, but I'm not going to say it never happens. I know I'm well aware of one case where it definitely did happen. So just to be clear on that.
Okay, so everybody should be prepared for that, sounds like. Well, and speaking of being prepared, what are the odds of an inspection? Like how many are completed in a year, domestic or overseas?
Yeah, let me back up too. And I don't know if I addressed this very clearly in the last inspection. There are samples that are collected of records. These are referred to as doc samples. They're not done that frequently in the food arena, the food program, but they can be done. So if those are done, you'll know because FDA is asking for records showing interstate commerce, and they're asking for an affidavit and related to the record specifically. That those are done when they're building a specific GMP or PC or HACCP type case against you. So those are an option too, is what is referred to as documentary samples or doc samples. I'm sorry, Anna, I may have forgotten what you asked me. How many inspections are done roughly per year?
That's very important information too. Yeah. The next question was just about the odds of an inspection. How many are completed, and is there?
This is a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
This is a tough one because FDA uses a risk profile to decide who's going to be inspected and when. FSMA had some specific timeframes that inspections were to be done, but there are so many companies out there. In the US, FDA really tries to keep to those timeframes. So low risk firms are inspected once every 5 years, high risk once every 2 years. They fell behind during COVID and they were catching up when I left, but that's the timeframe in the US. For foreign companies though, the inspection is going to really depend very much on risk or compliance history that you have. So if you've had a recall of product in the US or even a recall overseas that has a significant public health concern, then it does become more likely that FDA is going to conduct an inspection of your facility. If you make a very low risk product, I gave the example of the bakery, you've never had a problem, you're a bakery, you're in compliance, FSVP inspection has been done and there's no problems. It's unlikely FDA does about 900 to 1,100 foreign inspections a year, and there's literally, I think, at least 100,000 firms, foreign firms that are registered. And if you're registered, though, FDA can inspect. So it just depends on a number of factors whether or not FDA is going to take the time, the energy, and the money to inspect you.
Okay, great. So have a question from a foreign company, manufacturing company in Mexico that produces baked snacks. So will the FDA then provide the prior notice before conducting the inspection?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, for a foreign company in Mexico producing baked snacks, their question is, will the FDA provide prior notice before conducting the inspection?
Typically, yes. Mexico, there is an agreement with the Mexican government. This is the Mexico firm, right? If it's Mexico, there is an agreement with the Mexican government. Sometimes FDA will communicate through its foreign office in Mexico City with the Mexican government and get information from the Mexican government to avoid an inspection or to get information, or the Mexican government may do the inspection for FDA and share information, or FDA may come and do the inspection and be joined by the Mexican government. But really, those things would be done if there is a real pressing need to inspect that facility. If it's a routine inspection and FDA says we're going to do a routine inspection, then they may do it. But the odds are low, assuming you have a low risk product and you've had no recalls, you haven't had allergen issues, you've got FSVP for your supply, for your importing product. Most likely you're not going to have an inspection. I can never make promises though about that, because it really depends on internal to FDA. Another factor that sometimes happens is FDA is trying to fill up an inspection itinerary for a CSO. And this happened to me once, where I was sent on a trip and I had a short inspection at one facility, and then there was a facility a few blocks away and they gave me an assignment to go there, and it was a really low risk facility. I couldn't understand why I was doing it. The firm itself couldn't understand why I was doing it, but I figured it had to be because it was right in the same town close by. And so that is a possibility, but I don't think that was, 20 years ago at least. And I think they try to be more judicious in their decisions on who they inspect, looking more towards risk, much more towards risk now than they would do in terms of just looking at the geography.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in terms of allocating industry or agency resources, certainly. And global supply chains being as convoluted as they can sometimes be, this next question actually may impact a number of people that are attending today. How does it work if we do not export anything to the US, but some retailers buying our products are then exporting our products there? Do we still require inspection due to this being our brand?
You do. Well, you could. Again, it depends on all those factors I mentioned, but you should be registered, and any registered firm is subject to inspection.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I see some questions in our chat, Anna.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Do you want to hit some of those?
Certainly. Okay, let's see. Here we have, we are an olive oil company and we are FDA registered. We sent a product from another company, but it is FDA registered by the second company. This product, when arrived to the US, was tested and found to be contaminated. The action should be taken against us or against the second company.
So
they sent a product from another company.
Yeah, so technically you shipped a product that was violative to the US. So technically FDA can take action against you for sending an adulterated product or a misbranded product to the US. So that is possible. I would hope that FDA would look at taking, depending on how significant and what the product is, I would hope FDA would follow up with the second company as well, the person that you received it from. Yeah, it could be both, I guess is the best answer I can give you. If FDA sent you a formal letter, not just a notice of refusal, or then you should address it through that formal letter process. But if it's an import, you're probably addressing it through the import process, and it may go no further than dealing with that at the import process and possibly getting the product relabeled if it's a labeling violation or something like that. Hope that's helpful. Thanks for that question.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Here's another interesting question. Is there a possibility for the inspectors to have unannounced visits to a premise on weekends or public holidays?
Yes, and that would happen, and it would be extremely rare. And government employees, we had 11 holidays, and we valued those holidays, in the US. And so we typically wouldn't. Now, if you're a foreign company and you're subject to inspection and it's a holiday in your country, you need to tell the person who contacts you about that holiday so that they can plan for that. They generally would not plan. If your company is going to be closed, tell them we're going to be closed on this date. Tell them we're going to be closed on that date. FDA isn't going to generally go out of its way to make you open your facility so that FDA can do an inspection. So it's unlikely. I'm not going to say it never happens. You know, I can remember working late Christmas Eve on an emergency. So if there's an emergency, if there's public health involved, FDA the investigators will do whatever they have to do to make sure that public health is protected. So if it's a serious, significant issue, FDA will do inspections on weekends, on holidays, you know, after hours, whatever it takes to make sure that public health is protected.
Okay, great. Our next question is very timely, given everything that's happening in the US right now. The question is related to the shutdown. What are the FDA operations like during a government shutdown? Is everyone still online, or are there certain departments that go dark during this time?
So I'm going to just address the food side of things because it gets complicated with the other product centers. Routine FDA inspections will not be going on. If it's a routine, and I discussed during the first presentation that there are routine and then there are for cause inspections. So routine should be stopped. However, for cause inspections will continue, whether it's follow up to a problem before or it is you know, a current outbreak going on, emergency, those will continue. Compliance actions that are pending, those will continue until the compliance action is completed. In other words, if FDA was working on a warning letter for your facility before the shutdown, it will continue the work to complete that warning letter. And the warning letter will be issued, and then whoever did that work will stop working. So it depends on what's going on, specifically what will happen. Follow-up to outbreaks will continue, monitoring for outbreaks will continue, but anything that's routine is going to end. I should also say that the pressure on the CSOs is really high during this time. If you are under inspection, all import operations will continue as well. So import operations don't end. Product can't stack up at the border. So import operations will continue as they always do. Imports are not closed. CSOs are under a lot of pressure at this time. They have no administrative help for the most part. They're operating possibly without a supervisor, except, you know, I finish my report, they contact their supervisor, the supervisor, it's then their turn to review it, but the supervisor may not even be working on some days. So they're under pressure because they don't have a supervisor to help them necessarily. They don't have administrative help. And remember, they're not getting paid. So they haven't had a paycheck in 3 weeks now. I think they got a partial paycheck the first week of October or the second week of October. So they're not getting paid. They still have to buy their own lunch or buy their food for lunch, take care of their families. If they have daycare, they got to pay for that. They got to pay rent or mortgage payments. So they're under a lot of pressure right now, as all federal employees who are working are. So if you're being inspected, please be kind to the CSO. Don't offer them anything, though. Don't offer them a gift card. Don't offer them cash. Don't offer them food. Any of that would be considered a bribe by FDA or could be considered a bribe. So just be understanding of them and their situation. You know, show some compassion, you know, to them. It will go a long way just towards the relationship you have with them. And I do want to say that inspections, some of them can take a while, and you do develop a relationship with the CSO, and those can be valuable later on as well. You can contact that person and ask them additional questions if you have them. So having a good, positive relationship with that CSO who inspected you can be a really positive thing to have in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yes. The next question from a company in Malaysia. If the product we're registering with FDA is no longer produced in the factory, will FDA still come for an inspection?
Repeat that. I'm sorry, I got lost at the end.
Yeah, sorry. If the product that, I presume they mean when they've done their food facility registration, the products that they've indicated on that registration is no longer being produced in the factory, will US FDA still come for an inspection?
So if that's the only product you make and you need to correct your registration, and if you are contacted and told we're going to inspect you, maybe something happened with the data system, FDA still thinks you make that product, then you need to tell FDA we no longer make that product, and then FDA likely will not inspect. If you make more products, then they may inspect to cover other products. So it, again, like every other question, it can be complicated. But most likely, if you provide evidence that you are not making that product that is shipped to the US anymore, you're no longer sending product to the US, you're not, then if your registration gets corrected and you're not registered, FDA would have no reason to inspect you.
Okay, so keeping everything up to date on your FDA registration sounds like a very important thing to do.
It is. I see we're at the top of the hour. I can go a few more minutes,
Okay.
Anna.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll try and fit in a few more. Thank you, Larry. Next question. What are the most common documentation gaps FDA investigators flag during preventive controls inspections, and what distinguishes a minor from a major nonconformance?
Okay. So I didn't do the data search to find out what the most common observations are. That information is available on the FDA website because they do list every observation, and you can do a sort to find out what's most common. But I did list the most common observations noted. And I can scroll back to that if you don't mind, Anna.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see it. So FSVP, if you remember, was the first one. I'm sorry, this is taking a little bit of time to go back to it. But the most serious ones are failure to have done your hazard analysis. That's the most serious one. Not having a PCQI, not doing your hazard analysis. Those are the most serious violations, and those are the ones that will definitely get you a warning letter, if not further action. So you can see the second observation: you did not conduct operations under conditions and controls necessary to minimize the potential for growth of microorganisms, allergen cross contact, contamination of food, deterioration of food. That was the second most common one. So this is your plan either missed something. Typically, sometimes it may be an environmental sampling issue, so you may not be doing sufficient environmental sampling, or FDA environmental sampling found microorganisms in the production area. So that would be an example of that. Or FDA noted that if you sequence your products to avoid allergen, they may notice that you produced outside of that sequence. So that would be conditions whereby the allergen cross contact's a possibility, those sorts of things. The third one is reasonable personnel practices. So this is one that honestly has to be observed during the inspection. It might be that FDA noticed during a shift change, people came back to shift and they didn't wash their hands appropriately, or they didn't put on gloves before handling ready-to-eat product. Those are the most common observations related to personnel practices. Those can be serious if you make a product that could carry a human pathogen such as norovirus. And so I would say that the first two that I mentioned are the most serious ones. Those ones that are on this list would be the most common observations.
So it sounds like a rigorous review of your food safety plans that every company should really be considering doing that on a fairly routine basis, certainly.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And also,
it's required to be done annually. You have to review your food safety plan annually. So that's not true for seafood HACCP and juice HACCP, but those need to be reviewed annually. Let's do one more question, Anna, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. So I have one that kind of is related to sort of, I guess, the interaction between different FDA enforcement actions. This one says, we are a company from abroad that exports to the US. We recently received a notice of action, so I presume then through a detention, in the port, and have responded accordingly. Should we expect a visit from FDA at any point? And if so, will the FDA notify us in advance of such a visit?
So simply receiving a notice that your product is being held at the border and there's a problem with it does not trigger an inspection. It would be added to your kind of risk profile depending on the issue. It really does, and I hate to say this, but so many things depend specifically on the issue. If there's a specific threat to public health related to the product that you ship to the US, and that's why it's being detained. For example, you shipped a product and it was tested and found to have salmonella in it that could make people sick. That's a significant issue, and FDA may decide that it needs to do an inspection based on that. If it happened more than once, obviously it becomes much more likely that FDA would do something about it. So it depends specifically on the issue and how that affects the risk profile that your firm has. But simply receiving notice and having product detained and you addressing it and correcting it or demonstrating that the product meets FDA requirements in one way or another should not trigger an inspection. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, and if I can sort of tag on to that too, you know, my team specifically at Registrar Corp, we handle lots of detentions throughout the course of the year. And, you know, every now and then we'll talk to companies who will say that, oh, I'll refuse entry and just deal with it later. Or, you know, they go ahead and let it get refused entry, even if they can fix the problem. And, you know, our advice is always to try and fix the problem if you can in port, because the cascading effect of having your risk profile go up certainly, you know, can yield some rather undesirable outcomes. So, you know, just, yeah, deal with your detentions is my 2 cents in all of this.
Yeah, and it can trigger first an FSVP inspection if there hasn't been one done already. Mm-hmm. So that could trigger an FSVP inspection more likely, which are done remotely, right? Mm-hmm. And they're done at the U.S. Location of the importer, whoever's the U.S. agent.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very good to know.
You want to do one more, Anna? Then okay. I do need to end.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for letting us go over a bit with all your expertise. Let's see. Oh, here's a question. Wondering whether or not FDA informs the local regulatory body before an inspection, I presume for a foreign inspection.
Yeah, typically they do. There may be some places where they don't, but my experience has been, yes, they do notify the local regulatory authority, often invite them to join FDA, although, you know, their schedules may or may not afford that. And that's also done typically in the States with the US state authority. So it may be done with the national authority, in Mexico. I mentioned the Mexican authority might be invited or asked to do an inspection for FDA to share results. In an emergency situation, they would typically be invited to join the inspection. FDA does rely on that authority if it is a surprise inspection, which isn't typically done overseas, but can be. It relies on that authority not telling the firm that FDA is coming, but since most are pre-notified inspections, so, and you are free to notify your authority FDA is coming as well. In case they don't know, it's not necessarily a bad idea to let them know FDA is coming or to share the inspection report with them. I mentioned inspection reports are mailed to the facility. That's both domestic and foreign. You know, sharing that inspection, especially a nice inspection that shows your NAI, is really a nice thing to share with people. So,
Great. Thank you. And yeah, with that, we'll need to wrap it up. So a big thank you to everyone for being here. And please do fill out the survey that you'll see as we all start to exit the webinar. It really does help us continue to support the industry with webinars that are of value to you. So we really appreciate the feedback. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful day.